Hello, and welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell. I'm Associate Counsel for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I am joined today in our studio by FFRF's Equal Justice Works fellow, Kat Grant. Hi, Kat. Today, Kat and I are going to give some updates on the religious rights war against trans people. It's been about a quarter since Pride Month, and a lot's been happening. So we're going to share what's been going on in the courts, in the legislatures, and the medical community. And as always, if you have questions about our topic today, you can drop them in the comments below, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. So, Kat.
Yeah, so the last time we sat down to discuss the flood of anti-transgender legislation, there really had not been enough time to read the tea leaves on what the courts would do. You know, there was all of this litigation going through. Since then, however, we have seen quite a few positive results, with judges calling this political push for what it is, religiously motivated bigotry.
Yay! So, first thing we're going to do is talk about a couple of the big movements in the court cases that involve legislation, anti-trans legislation. So, first case we're going to talk about is Brandt versus Rutledge. This is a case about a gender-affirming care ban. Why don't you give us some background on the case and what movement have we seen?
Yeah, so Brandt v. Rutledge was back in June, and that was actually our first instance of a gender-affirming care ban being completely and totally struck down. This was in Arkansas. This case had actually started back in 2021 when Arkansas first passed a gender-affirming care ban for minors, which banned medical providers from providing gender-affirming procedures or referring minors to providers of gender-affirming procedures. This case had been making its way through the courts, and, it got in front of a federal judge. And this was a full-on 80-page scathing decision by this judge, Judge Moody, with 311 findings of fact, just tearing down all of this anti-trans animus we've seen. They've gone through what even is the process for receiving gender-affirming care? What does it look like? How long does it take? Are these myths about trans kids being given puberty blockers and hormones like candy actually real, which they aren't. And most importantly, I think especially to those of us who are watching how this is connected to state-church separation, he really went through the state's witnesses and noticed that, they had been recruited by our good friends over at the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Shocked, I tell you.
And only one of them have ever treated trans people whatsoever, had never treated trans youth, had no, background in what the current standards of care for trans youth are. And right out the bat, Judge Moody said, you are clearly conflicted, even though your medical expertise is credible. You are clearly conflicted between what you know about medical science and what your faith is. The rest of these experts had never treated trans kids, have no background in medical science, or if they did, completely unrelated areas of medical science. And, the judge was very quick to point out, you were recruited to speak on the basis of religious ideology and not the actual medical science. So your testimony is not credible. This is not something that should be considered when looking at this ban and whether or not it is permissible.
Right. So this is actually really encouraging, and all it really is like straight talk, right? Just a federal judge kind of calling it how he sees it in evaluating the evidence before him and just to kind of break it down, what the judge is ruling on, it was and is in a lot of these cases in early days, an injunction, right? Whether or not they, the judge should block the law from going into effect while these cases are being litigated. And so in examining the evidence is witness testimony. In this case, it's expert witnesses that ADF is putting forward as qualified to give their medical opinions on some of the factual questions in the case, like how or whether gender affirming care is harmful, and all of these other things. And so when the judge is saying these witnesses are not credible, there's two things going on. One is that the judge is questioning or rejecting their qualification as experts in this particular area. Regular witnesses off the street can't give their opinions. They're supposed to testify to facts: who, what, when, where, what they saw, what they know. Experts are qualified to give their opinions because they are judged by the court to have been qualified as experts in a specific issue area that's relevant to the questions before the court. This judge is saying these are medical professionals, the ones that are being put forth as experts, but they don't have expertise in the issues relevant to this case. So they don't pass the high standard needed to be qualified as experts and have their opinions on trans gender affirming care treated as credible by the court. And then the witness credibility piece, right? The court is always judging the credibility of witnesses, which just means they're offering their testimony as evidence. How much do you believe them, or how much weight do you give what they're testifying to the court? And the judge is finding that they don't have much credibility because obviously, or it is obvious to the court, that they are motivated by religious ideology and not by factual medical evidence and data. And so, or even experience in the case of the medical professionals. So that's a really big deal, and really germane to FFRF's push to push back against anti-trans policies, because they are obviously and provably motivated by religious ideology and not science, data, fact, and reason.
Right. And the judge even went into some of these studies that we have seen being cited by this anti-trans push. And, you know, there's all of this talk about how there's not high-quality evidence. Now, the term high-quality evidence, of course, is not what it sounds like colloquially. High-quality evidence, you know, TM, doesn't exist for 90% of medical treatments because it is impossible to ethically produce this randomized high-quality evidence with placebos and control groups because of the damage it can do to actual human beings. Now, that being said, we just very recently have seen that there was a landmark study that was released out of Melbourne regarding suicidality in trans people, where they took two groups, one group of transmasculine people who received testosterone immediately upon presenting for care versus a second group who received care after the standard 3 months. 55% of the people who were in that group that received care immediately saw a reduction in suicidality compared to the 5% in the control group who waited the standard 3 months. Like I said, this is the first truly randomized study of its kind, and this is really, really important because it's in line with the other long-term studies about gender-affirming care. You know, these results have been seen in non-randomized studies, you know, usually in the range of 50 to 77%, somewhere around there. Now, some of you who might be familiar with the discussions that have been had about transgender healthcare and mental health might be aware of this Swedish study that was done back in the 80s and 90s that a lot of anti-trans folks like to point at and see there was a very high rate of suicidality amongst trans people even after transition. Therefore, we should not be supporting transitioning. However, this is really cherry-picked and taken out of its historical context. When you actually go and read that study, when you actually take the time to look at it beyond what you are seeing, and I encourage you, don't just listen to me. Go read the study. When I say beyond just what people on social media are yelling about, I'm a people on social media yelling about this. But, you know, it shows that when people were supported, when they had economic support, when they had family support, when they did not lose their jobs, when they were not experiencing high levels of violence, that suicidality level did not exist. There was also another major thing leading to suicidality amongst trans and gay people in the 80s and 90s, the AIDS crisis. Like, I cannot overemphasize how terrifying historically the AIDS crisis was for the queer community, and how all of that has to be taken into context, that transition does not cause suicidality. There is no evidence to suggest that. There has never been evidence to suggest that. That is more related to the issues surrounding the rejection of trans people socially. So you really have to think about that. Also, when you're thinking about the claims that people are making about the effect that especially trans youth have on their classmates and other students.
Right. Well, that's a great transition to another case that we want to talk about and update in. So this is Bethel District Board of Education. This was a case that was filed in Ohio. Was filed by America First Legal, which is yet another conservative legal group, ultra-conservative, headed by Stephen Miller, infamous Trump advisor, who is started this, legal advocacy group to sue the Biden administration and promote these lawsuits that push back against everything woke and equity. So this lawsuit in Ohio was brought on behalf of a group of Christian and Muslim students and parents who were suing the school district, trying to force them to undo their trans-inclusive bathroom policy because they had a trans girl that was the school district was permitting to use the communal girls' bathroom. So the claim was kind of notable because it was being brought on, among other bases, a free exercise religious right claim. So basically saying that the school's policy of allowing trans youth to use communal bathrooms violates the religious rights of these other non-trans students and their parents. And they brought other claims, not just free exercise. They had a Title IX claim in there. They were claiming parental rights, like constitutionally based parental rights and equal protection. But in August, a Trump-appointed judge that this case was assigned to actually dismissed all these claims, meaning they rejected the plaintiffs' arguments that their rights are being violated by trans-inclusive bathroom policies. So, Kat, what was the breakdown and kind of the nuts and bolts of this ruling?
Yeah, so basically the free exercise claim was based on the school updated their bathroom policy based on the current federal interpretation of Title IX. So right now, Title IX is interpreted as, trans students are protected from discrimination based on the Bostock ruling. For those who are not familiar, Clayton County v. Bostock was the Title VII ruling a couple of years ago that ruled that trans people have protections from discrimination in the workplace under Title VII. Typically, Title IX is interpreted via Title VII. Bostock, all they said in Bostock, and I've said this over and over again because people like to jump on it and say, well, the court said they weren't touching Title IX, so it doesn't apply to Title IX. That's not what that means. That just means, hey, we're not touching that right now because that's not relevant to this case. But the Federal Department of Education has said over and over again, trans students have a right to use the bathroom, be referred to by their proper name, and not be discriminated against in public education. We've also seen multiple circuit courts say the same thing. The Sixth Circuit, where Ohio is located, has said that. So, the school was trying to operate consistent with the circuit they are in. The Seventh Circuit just also ruled that trans students have a right to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. We just saw that over the summer with the Martinsville and Vigo County cases. So the school adopted this policy that said, hey, students can use the bathroom of their gender identity. This group of Christian and Muslim parents got very upset about this. They had been aware that there was a trans student ahead of time. And so this group of Muslim parents, very interestingly, apparently donated the funds and materials to build 2 single-stall restrooms. And they claim it was with the understanding that those would be for the trans students and that their students would never have to interact with a trans student in the communal bathroom. And so now they are claiming that because the school put out this policy and also said, hey, we just had this really generous donation of these single-stall bathrooms, so if anyone is uncomfortable using the gender-neutral or the communal gender restroom, they can go use the single-stall restroom. And they are saying that interacting with trans people in the bathroom somehow is a substantial burden on their religious practice and is therefore discrimination based on religious belief because their students say that they cannot use the restroom. Now, I am not making light of the fact that these students are probably being taught to fear trans people and that, we're these scary boogeymen that are going to commit sexual assault. I understand that these are kids. Their parents, another story. But I understand that these are children who, the complaint goes into the fact that they are, holding it and not using the bathroom at school whatsoever, which is something that gets pointed to for trans students being able to use the bathroom because that causes serious medical problems. I do not fault these children. These are mostly elementary school age children. I fault their parents for teaching them this. But what the judge points out is that, first of all, parents have never, and there is a long string of cases that the judge cites to point to this, never had a right to control school operations because they point out there is no way for a school to be able to, create wholesale policy that fits every single family's religious, moral, and ethical beliefs. It's just not possible. This accommodation was created, and most importantly, there is nothing in the policy that says the Christian students can't use the bathroom. There's nothing in the policy that says the Muslim students can't use the bathroom. Everyone can still use the bathroom. It is neutrally applied across religion. If you are personally uncomfortable, there is a perfectly acceptable accommodation. And again, it's worth noting, even though the policy now says that trans students can use the bathroom of their, identified gender, they may still choose to use the single-stall restroom because of social reprisal, perhaps being brought by these students and what they are being taught by their parents.
Right.
And so the judge basically looked at all of this, all of these claims, including the equal protection claim, including the Title IX claim, and was like, what are you doing? This is not how this works. This is not how any of this works. This is never how public schools have worked. And I think it's really notable that this was a Trump-appointed judge because what have we been saying basically every episode of Ask an Atheist? The conservative control of the courts is a huge problem, and it is still a huge problem. But I think it's really telling when you see these hyper-conservative judges, and it's not just this judge in Ohio. We've also seen Trump-appointed judges in Indiana and other really highly conservative states say, this is going too far. All of this anti-trans stuff is going too far on various topics, especially on gender-affirming care and bathrooms, where they're saying, this is causing way more harm than good. What's even happening? These are impermissible purposes. So I think that really speaks to, this legislation is so far out there, and especially when you think about it is being written and, sent to legislators by these hyper-conservative groups, just how harmful and dangerous all this legislation is and how unwilling judges are to put up with it.
Yeah. It's really important, though, too, the sort of searching examination of the evidence or the information that is brought to support these claims or to defend these laws, because this is where a lot of anti-trans myth busting is coming from, is some of these judges that are evaluating like we talked about earlier, evaluating the credibility and the relevance and weighing the evidence that is being used to support these anti-trans laws and policies, right? It doesn't need to pass any of those tests to motivate a legislature to pass it, but the courts are supposed to be a place where is actually evaluated, its credibility is weighed, and then decisions are made about whether it is constitutional, whether it violates statutory law. And so a good thing about some of these outcomes in the early stages of litigation against anti-trans laws is that we're seeing some of these claims, get tested by the rules of evidence and judges writing opinions like the ones we're talking about today, is doing some important myth busting that has been supporting some of this legislation. So it's tepid good news, but keep in mind that these cases are exploding all over the country, all over the federal courts and circuits, and the Supreme Court has not spoken on one of these cases yet.
Yeah, we are very much anticipating in the next couple of years, in the next few Supreme Court terms, that we are going to see the Supreme Court tackle these issues. And that's where I have a lot of concerns. I think that's where you have a lot of concerns. I think that's where most people have a lot of concerns, because we see cases where we watch the district court get in at least what our opinion is the right answer.
Right.
And then the court just decides, actually, no. And we're going to do this.
And even the circuit courts of appeal, and what we've seen in this Supreme Court is a lot of activism in terms of taking cases where there's not really a traditional basis for Supreme Court jurisdictional involvement. Like usually that's reserved for a circuit split where the country, the circuit courts of appeals, the federal appellate courts are kind of split on an issue. They're analyzing, they're taking their cues from the Supreme Court. They're analyzing the same cases, but they're coming to different results, and there's conflict in the law.
Like, that's why we haven't seen, even though bathrooms have been made accessible to trans students since before Bostock, I believe since 2017 was Whitaker, something around there. There hasn't been a circuit split on that, so we have not seen that make its way to the Supreme Court. Now, there is currently a circuit split on teachers and pronouns, and we think that will probably be one of the first things to make its way up to the Supreme Court. And I also think gender-affirming care is going to make its way, because unfortunately, while we are seeing a lot of good results right now on gender-affirming care of judges being like, slow your roll, this is not appropriate, this is not how we've ever approached medicine, calm down for a minute, we are also seeing judges uphold these bans. And so there is going to be a major split. And so, unfortunately, we are still at the whims of either the judges taking it because there is one of these traditional reasons for taking it, or 303 creative situations where groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom just kind of make stuff up. And the court's like, we like you, so we're going to take that case.
Exactly. They've been taking cases where there's not a traditional reason for doing so, but the court is ready to speak on a cultural issue and kind of set the course of policy in a more conservative direction. And this seems like an issue area where the threat of that is really high. Okay, so I want about the half hour. I want to take some questions and kind of just see where the conversation goes, because I do think we get a lot of really good questions from some of our members on these issues, and we'll see where that goes. Oh, okay. All right, so let's start here. Since courts are rightfully striking down gender-affirming care bans for youth, what's the next step for legislators and conservative groups pushing these bans? Are they likely to back down from this stance? Ha ha, LOL is an addition by me. That's a good question, right? Like, where do super conservative, trans-hating legislators go once these bans are struck down by the courts? And are we seeing them regroup, pass new bans, or should we talk about Tennessee drag ban, where we have government officials just telling municipalities that they can ignore court orders?
Well, I think the first immediate answer to that question is the place that they go from here is the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Semicolon, however, comma, I think we also need to note that we have an election coming up. And I think a lot of these hyper-conservative politicians have latched on to trans issues and abortion being the things that they're like, yes, this is what we're going to campaign on. And as we saw with like Ohio issue 1, that was not spectacular. That was not a winner. So we may have to hit pause and see what happens after 2024. But yeah, I do think we should talk about the Tennessee drag case because, as I said in a panel I was on last week, law is fake. And people kind of just do whatever they want, including this prosecutor in Tennessee in Blount County. So this was a case where the statewide ban on drag in Tennessee was one of those drag bans that got blocked for being constitutionally overbroad. You know, it was really vague, but the legislative record made it clear that they were targeting drag performers, even though not all drag is obscene or sexual, et cetera, et cetera. And there was this conflict that arose where this one prosecutor in Blount County decided, okay, well, they said, okay, hang on, this has been blocked, but that only applies to the district where the judge was sitting. That doesn't apply to the whole state, even though, again, this seems to be the common theme. That's not how any of this works. This is not how any of this has ever worked. It's always been, once there is a block on it, that is where it is until the legislation.
Because again, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a state law being blocked, not a ordinance of a municipality, but a state law being blocked. Yeah,
this was a state law that was blocked for being constitutionally overbroad. So basically the idea there is, if it's constitutional or unconstitutional in one district, it's going to be unconstitutional in the other district. This prosecutor saw that there was a Pride Fest coming up. Drag queen and Christian music performer Flamey Grant was going to be performing, which if you aren't familiar with Flamey Grant, please look up her work. It is incredible. And said, hey, we will be prosecuting people for if drag happens at this Pride event, we will prosecute. And, the ACLU jumped in immediately. He sent this really whack, for lack of a better word, threatening letter to them. ACLU and some other organizations jumped in, sued, and basically right now where that stands is the Pride Festival, which I think was last weekend or maybe the weekend before, went on as scheduled, and nothing is going to move forward with that until another Memphis area case that is in a similar situation gets decided. But yeah, you see things like prosecutors deciding, I see that the council has made a decision, but considering that's a stupid decision, I've elected to ignore it. And that's kind of their next thing is they're just going to start saying, you know what, though? I don't care what judges say.
Right. It's like abuse of power, intimidation, social intimidation, and of course, regrouping to write different legislation or to bone up. This is kind of following the blueprint of anti-abortion bans, figuring out better ways to write legislation in anticipation of being sued. So I think it's harder in this context because it's I just think it's harder in this context because it doesn't involve that complicated issue of pregnancy and competing interests. But anyway, I do think they're going to legislators that are obsessed with
controlling people's bodies.
Yes, are going to control people's bodies. They're going to appeal and lean on the courts, knowing that they have captured, that ultra-conservative forces have captured many of the both district and appellate courts, keep appealing these cases, and then keep rewriting these laws and spending their time on this instead of other things. Well, here's one that's kind of interesting. We're talking about youth bans, but in states where legislators are extremely hostile to the trans community, I've seen arguments for banning gender-affirming care for adults as well. Is this something worth worrying about? Yes.
Yes.
Or will these laws be struck down? What can trans people do in these states if they can't get out? That's a follow-up question.
Yes.
That's really useful.
Yeah, we are seeing attacks on gender-affirming care for adults. Florida, I think, is really, unfortunately, taking the model for this. Right now, 80% of transgender adults cannot receive their health care in Florida because they're on Medicare and Medicaid, and the recent round of, blocking transgender health care prohibits Medicare and Medicaid funds from going to transition-related care.
In Florida?
Yep. Which, if that sounds familiar, it's the abortion playbook.
Yeah.
It is always the abortion playbook. I've said it before, I'll say it again, over and over again. They are just copy-pasting a lot of their legal structures. So we actually just, I think in the past couple of days, it's escaping me when exactly this hit, because life is chaotic, and also this is updating basically by the hour.
Right.
I've been trying to write a Know Your Rights guide on all of this, and it's almost impossible because the rights keep changing.
And it's immediately outdated.
So, we are seeing a lot of concerns about this. As I always like to point people over to the work that Erin Reed does. She's a fantastic journalist who has been doing daily independent reporting on all of this. I lean on her work quite a bit. I think we all at this point lean on her work to even just keep up, because this is her full-time job, and frankly, just keeping up is a full-time job. So if you want to see, Erin Reed has now updated her legislative risk maps to show the difference between risk to youth and adults state by state. In terms of what you can do as a trans person who may be in a state with all of these issues going on and you can't get out. Number one, of course, always protect yourself. Do not self kind of risk. If you do feel like you can take a public stand, go testify in front of your state legislatures, write for your local newspaper. I'm the child of a local newspaper journalist, and so you might not think that your small town newspaper is worth writing something into, but it is, I promise. Show people that you are real and that you exist and that you are their neighbor, their bartender, their kid's teacher, their librarian, their, person working at the museum. Show them that you are just a normal person. And believe it or not, that does a ton. Get involved with your state legislatures. I cannot, again, emphasize enough how important knowing who your state legislator is, because they actually do want to listen to you. You are not going to see as much, rigmarole getting a hold of your local representative as you would on the federal level. So, really find out who those people are. Get involved. If you feel safe to, run for office. That's another thing that I think we don't talk about enough. We sit here and act like we are powerless against what the powers that be, and don't think about the fact that we can be the powers that be. So there are all of these things we can do to at least slow it down and add to the public shame that eventually, there is going to be enough backlash. I think courts are powerful, but I think the court of public opinion is also incredibly powerful. And if we just keep pushing, this entire movement, I really think is a death rattle. I think that the reason it is becoming so extreme is because these hyper-conservative, hyper-religious, transphobic people are just going as hard as they can because they know that the long arc of history is not in their favor. They know that they are losing this fight. They know that we have been here, that we are here, and that we are still going to be here at the end of this. So I think that's probably my biggest advice, is just be here.
Yeah.
Be loud, be proud, don't put your life in danger, but get involved and stay loud. And I think that's the most important thing.
All right. Well, speaking of the court of public opinion, and I'm curious, actually, Kat, what your thoughts are on this, because I think all of us have experienced some form of this, as this whole anti-trans movement is just like sweeping through every inch of the culture. How can I confront a coworker / friend / family member who believes anti-trans rhetoric spread by leaders is the question, but I'll add to that, like, cultural figures, even progressive cultural figures. I definitely have been surprised. Now I'm speaking. Oh, Liz Cavell hit my mic. Promised I wouldn't. I am speaking on my own behalf, where I've been surprised sometimes to find some of my like reliably progressive old friends that have just like really like warped views, really non-progressive views on all this anti-trans stuff. Like they're somehow hearing this messaging that's, you know, being whipped up, that's sort of being all the stuff you see busted in these court opinions, you know, all the harm and all that like youth harm narrative. How do you approach that, or have you seen that in any of even like surprising friends, coworkers, family members, acquaintances, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think a lot about, I'm from very rural, very conservative Indiana. And it's that weird space of, I don't necessarily feel safe in my hometown. You know, we were just talking about trans people not being able to leave. I was one of the very lucky trans people that was able to get out of Indiana before things are currently breaking bad and are going to continue to break bad. You know, there are a large number of trans adults, including myself, that are considered political refugees within our own country. And so I think a lot about those experiences that I've had with my neighbors, with my classmates, with people. And I am a big believer in compassion and empathy and community building. And I think this goes back a little bit to what I was talking about. People are scared of trans people because they don't know us. You know, we are a very small portion of the population. It's not that we're non-existent, but there aren't that many of us. And so people just haven't met us. And a lot of times, if you don't know a trans person, you don't think about trans issues. So, and I think this is one of those things where we've really struggled, is just staying ahead of the culture curve, where, you know, people are learning about trans people for the first time in this particular context. And so the information, when you learn about a new thing, it tends to be the first thing you learn is what sticks, right? So, you know, you're seeing all of these things, and I think especially when you see your progressive friends repeat things from, you know, I think J.K. Rowling is the good example of this, where J.K. Rowling, my entire childhood, you know, I was born in 1997, like right when Harry Potter really took off, has always been hailed as this mega progressive, mega feminist author and pop culture icon. But now you talk to any trans person about Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, and it's like, ooh, no, this has escalated so poorly to where, you know, there are all of these terrible, terrifying arguments, but people trust that authority. People trust this person that was a huge part of their childhoods. So I think starting from that place of empathy, of understanding that this is born out of ignorance first, and not necessarily malice. A lot of L's there. I think is, in terms of framing how you approach this, you know, when you're getting into that mindset, starting there. From there, I think it is, you know, come with resources, come with notes. Maybe this is just, you know, the autistic person in me, but I love having a citation. And just being like, here are the facts. Here's what's actually going on. And, you know, approach it from a place of, I know that you are a smart, empathetic, compassionate person. Here's what's actually going on. Here's what the data actually says. You know, bring stories. If you are not trans, if you are cis and you're an ally looking to help, because I think this is also something that we desperately need allies to step up and do this work, because it is also emotionally exhausting and sometimes unsafe for us to do. You know, bring forward stories of trans people, you know, say, hey, here are these resources. And I think that that does a lot, again, of just normalizing that, you know, there aren't cases of trans people assaulting women in women's restrooms. There aren't these cases of, you know, men going through the, you know, social, you know, issues that come with transitioning and going through medical care and estrogen treatments in order to beat women at swimming. You know, no one does that. No one goes through that. And just take it step by step and be patient. It is not, you know, you're not going to have some grand sermon where you change everybody's mind all at once. I truly wish, but every social movement is a lot like boiling the frog, where, you know, there's this metaphor of you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it's going to jump out immediately. You put the frog in a pot that's cold water and you slowly turn up the heat, it's not going to jump out. That is a terrifying metaphor, but I think it's really applicable to just really understanding the approach you need to take of being slow and compassionate and empathetic. And I think that's something that's very hard to do. I think a lot of us want to be right all the time, and we want everyone to accept that we are right. And that's just not helpful. That's not how you convince people. Now, if people are using slurs and saying that, you know, trans people need to be taken out back and shot, et cetera, that's a different story. And you don't have to engage with those people. You know, you're allowed to just step back and let people be wrong in their wrongness and be wrong. But I think I genuinely think most people are good. I genuinely think most people are kind. I think people are scared and confused and falling for a lot of really terrible rhetoric that, again, this death rattle of hyperconservatism, of patriarchal gender standards, of fascism in the United States. I truly, truly think that people are falling into this through no fault of their own.
Yeah. And like a riff on that is, but that's also frustrating. That makes it, and I am one of those like impatient people, especially with friends I consider like progressive allies, where I'm just like, what? It's misinformation. It's like they're bringing their like citations and they're like, no, this is totally true. Like I checked my sources and it's true that like there's, you know, 500 times more trans people today than there were in blah, blah, blah. And like, you know what I mean? Like there's these like statistics and things, and it's like they've been convinced by misinformation, not just, you know, rhetoric and like hateful stuff, but like they're falling for misinformation, and it is so hard to combat that.
Yeah. And again, I think that's just another case of knowing your stuff. I think one of the very helpful, you know, kind of combat to, especially the like, there are way more trans people now, is it's also, and there are a lot more people that write with their left hand, because we don't beat left-handedness out of people anymore. You know, I think talking about that, coming with examples of historical trans people, coming with examples of gender diversity that exist in cultures all across the world, you know, so much of our Western understanding of a gender binary comes out of Roman imperial conquest. And so, you know, just really dig into the history and just be patient and persistent. And I know that's not the answer anyone wants to hear, is just be patient. But I think that just keep coming at people with facts and kindness and empathy is maybe all we can do as well.
Right on. Well, that's a great note to end on. That will conclude Ask an Atheist for the week. Thank you for joining us. Join us next week right here. This Sunday on Free Thought Matters, Dan and Annie Laurie speak to Lerone Martin, author of the fascinating new book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. Here's a preview.
J. Edgar Hoover was a Christian, and he believed that America was founded as a Christian nation. And for Hoover, that notion of Christianity was very much so centered upon certain ideas about society, that society should be led by the Ten Commandments. In fact, he believed that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were founded upon the Ten Commandments. So he saw these founding documents as sacred. And he also believed that society was meant to be run by white men and solely by white men who were Christian. And he believed that all other races of people and all other genders were subordinate to white men and would have to always be led by white men.
You can watch Free Thought Matters on our YouTube and Facebook channels and on broadcast TV stations all across the U.S. Check out Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show and podcast. This week, Dan Barker and Annie Laurie Gaylor will feature a presentation by Florida LGBTQ activist Will Larkins. Find out where to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio. And of course, if you want more state-church separation talk from the perspective of women attorneys in our movement, check out the We Dissent podcast. Our latest episode, we talked with Liz Reiner Platt from Law Rights Religion Project at Columbia Law about how to reframe religious liberty and make religious exemptions work for progressive causes. Find us where you get podcasts. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, or at we-dissent.org. If you want more info about Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. We'll see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.